the topic given to me today is to talk about the role of chemotherapy in bone cancers. So I am Dr. Devrat Arya. I'm a medical oncologist. I'm from Delhi. I've done my MBBS from Maulana Azad, did my MD from Surat, and then my DM from GCR Ahmedabad, and I've been practicing for the past 9 years. So here we go. So we know that most bone cancers, bone sarcomas actually require multidisciplinary management. The surgeon, the orthopedic oncosurgeon is a very important component of the team, but so are radiation oncologists, pathologists, and medical oncologists. And because of the rarity of the tumor and the complicated management that these diseases usually require, it's very important that the treatment is done mostly at high volume cancer centers wherever it's possible, and multidisciplinary tumor board discussions for each and every case is to be encouraged. So broadly, for determining the right systemic therapy for bone sarcomas, obviously knowing subtype is important, but also for patients who have had a recurrent disease, we also need to understand what regimen has been offered earlier, what is the fitness of the patient, and what is the goal of the treatment, cure versus palliation. Needless to say, the goal has to be cure wherever possible. So this is a very interesting slide that I borrowed from Dr. Ramandeep, who's a pediatric oncologist. So how do you treat bone sarcomas, and what is the broad strategy when it comes to the treatment from a medical oncology perspective, that is in terms of chemotherapy? So obviously osteosarcoma are treated like osteosarcomas, but you have to think again if you're dealing with low-grade juxtapical or craniofacial head and neck osteosarcomas. Ewing sarcomas are treated like Ewing sarcomas. We also know chondrosarcomas, there's very minimal role of systemic therapy. Most of these patients with early stage disease will be operated. There's no role for adjuvant treatment unless it's a de-differentiated chondrosarcoma where there is some data to suggest that osteosarcoma like chemotherapy regimens may be beneficial. And similarly for mesenchymal chondrosarcomas, both osteo or Ewing's types of chemotherapy regimens have appeared to work. What about malignant fibrous histiocytoma of the bone? To be treated like osteosarcomas. Needless to say, also these soft tissue sarcoma subtypes like leiomyosarcoma and fibrosarcoma, when arising from the bone, are also typically treated like osteosarcomas. So coming to the first part of the talk today. So I won't be able to cover all subtypes, but I'll focus predominantly on osteosarcomas, Ewing sarcomas, and chondrosarcomas. I'll try and present data for both early disease and metastatic and recurrent disease, and also not only from pediatric perspective, but also I'd like to give some adult perspective for these diseases as well. So we know osteosarcoma seems to have a bimodal distribution. Majority of tumors occur in the early age group between 15 to 19, although there may be a subset of patients who have the disease at an older age. These are predominantly because of previous radiation or Paget's disease. There's a male predominance. The most common sites are distal femur and proximal tibia. We know that there are different subtypes of conventional osteosarcoma. So predominantly they are high grade, 80 to 90% are high grade, and the common subtypes include osteoblastic, chondroblastic, fibroblastic, and telangiectatic. Now, treatment remains the same, surgery and adjuvant chemotherapy. However, there is some twist when it comes to chemotherapy. I'll talk about it in the next slide. There are a subset of patients who have a low grade on osteosarcoma, particularly periosteal and paraosteal, and these are the tumors where you are focusing more on surgery. Obviously, there is now emerging evidence to suggest that a certain subset of paraosteal osteosarcomas actually also need to be treated with chemotherapy, and therefore you need to look at these tumors closely, the grade, the location, before you decide whether chemo is needed or not. So we all know that osteosarcoma traditionally has been systemic disease, even though right at the time of presentation, only about 10 to 20% patients have metastasis. Historically, we've seen that when these patients have been treated just with surgery, 5-year survivals have been in the range of 10 to 20%. The advent of chemotherapy has led to an improvement in survival, and as this curve shows, with the advent of chemotherapy, the overall survival has actually improved now to 60 to 70% in the long term. So, as I said, chemotherapy has contributed to improvement of survival. This came through data from initially studies that were not so large. The active agents appear to be methotrexate, doxorubicin. They also, most of these chemo regimens had bleomycin, cyclophosphamide, dactinomycin, vincristine, and cisplatin. And as the advances in treatment and advances in surgery happened, increasingly they were looking at limb sparing surgery, which meant that the surgeon needed to order a prosthesis, which needed a fabrication, which meant that there was a delay of about 9 to 10 weeks from the time of diagnosis to the time of surgery. And this is where neoadjuvant chemotherapy started happening. People started covering this time with neoadjuvant chemotherapy. The offset of this strategy was that you could actually assess pathological response to chemotherapy. So that started having prognostic effect. And also it has been importantly been realized that when you offer neoadjuvant chemotherapy, you actually are able to increase limb salvage rates in some patients. So we do know that there is some impact of subtype. We know that chondroblastic osteosarcoma have traditionally got lower rates of necrosis, yet the outcome is fairly similar between good and poor responders. However, for the other subtypes, when you talk about telangiectatic or fibroblastic osteosarcomas, they are more likely to respond to chemotherapy as compared to the conventional osteoblastic or the chondroblastic osteosarcomas. And except for the chondroblastic osteosarcomas, there is a clear-cut difference in survival when you compare those with a good response versus a poor response. So this slide very quickly shows the evolution of chemotherapy across different regimens, and you can see on the right side the EFS. There has been some improvement in EFS when you look at the studies that came from the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s. So how does neoadjuvant chemotherapy stack up with adjuvant chemotherapy? I think small trial, the pediatric oncology group study 8651 looked at that question. Patients were randomized to upfront surgery followed by adjuvant chemotherapy or some neoadjuvant chemotherapy, similar regimen for about 9 to 10 weeks, followed by surgery, and the remaining chemotherapy was offered as adjuvant. And on the right hand side of your slide, you can see that the event-free survival and the overall survival was similar in both the arms. So the difference was not statistically significant. So this study, even though it was criticized because the cure rates and the limb salvage rates were lesser as compared to what you see historically, this study clearly shows that the adjuvant and neoadjuvant setting, the chemotherapy remains the same. So these are some of the active agents: doxorubicin, cisplatin, methotrexate, and ifosfamide, which are conventionally used in the advanced or the more modern regimens. And the treatment strategy for most of our patients is to offer neoadjuvant chemotherapy, somehow improve percentage necrosis, offer surgical resection followed by chemotherapy. So this is what I was talking about, the prognostic importance of pathological response. So we know that the cutoff seems to be 90%, and those patients who are able to achieve 90% pathological response have a much better event-free survival in the range of 70 to 80% compared to those who are not able to achieve a response, which is in the range of about 40 to 50% for those who are not able to achieve a pathological response. But what is also important to see is that when you compare this data with those patients who have just surgery and do not end up receiving chemotherapy at all, the curve for even those patients who have a less than 90% tumor response continues to be better. It sits higher as compared to those treated with surgery alone. So even if a patient has not had a good pathological response, chemotherapy should be continued for these patients. So what is the optimal regimen for these patients? What is the optimal regimen for these patients? So there are various regimens that have been studied. You have the cisplatin doxorubicin, you have the MAP regimen, which is high dose methotrexate along with doxorubicin and cisplatin, and other regimens as well. We don't know what is the optimal regimen. It has not been established yet. So there has always been a debate between a 2-drug regimen, a cisplatin doxorubicin, versus a 3-drug regimen and a 4-drug regimen. And particularly, there has been a lot of debate regarding high-dose methotrexate as well. So coming to high-dose methotrexate, there have been a few randomized clinical trials which have looked at a 2-drug regimen, which is combined doxorubicin along with cisplatin, versus a multi-drug regimen which has involved high-dose methotrexate. And when you look at individual trials, in most of these trials, you would actually see that there hasn't been any statistically significant difference in either progression-free survival or overall survival. So in fact, for pathological good response when you compare a methotrexate containing regimen versus a non-methotrexate containing regimen. And that's why there's been a lot of controversy regarding the role of high-dose methotrexate. Uh, Interestingly, it actually took a meta-analysis. So this was, in fact, no, this is the paper from Ferrari, and this was an interesting paper published in Tumori of 2014, where that group actually compared the results of two trials, both involving high-dose methotrexate. The first was the ISG-OS1 study, which had a higher level of cumulative doses. Doxorubicin at 420, methotrexate at 120 gram per meter square, and cisplatin along with ifosfamide, and they compared the results with the OSS study, which actually reduced the number of methotrexate cycles from 10 to 5, which meant that the cumulative methotrexate dose reduced from 120 gram per meter square to 60 gram per meter square. And this very nice comparison actually showed that the 5-year overall survival rates with the higher cumulative methotrexate dose was 80%, and the EFS rates were 50%, compared to 73% with the lower methotrexate and 64% for the EFS figures for the lower methotrexate level. And interestingly, this data suggested that there is an importance of cumulative doses of methotrexate when it comes to assessing long-term data of event-free survival and overall survival, and therefore it's very important when we are dissecting studies which are looking at methotrexate containing regimen, and we look at the cumulative doses of methotrexate offered in the chemotherapy protocol. So this is the meta-analysis that I was talking about. So obviously the question that they asked was, what is better? Is a 2-drug regimen, how does it stack against a 3-drug regimen, or in fact a 4-drug regimen? And in fact, this meta-analysis, which actually contained only 2 randomized trials and most of the other studies, so it had, I think, 9 studies, in which 7 were phase 2 single-arm studies. But whatever it is, the data showed that there was an improvement in not only event-free survival, but also overall survival when you compared a 3-drug regimen versus a 2-drug regimen. And the hazard ratio for both these were in the range of 0.7 to 0.8. And this meta-analysis clearly showing, as you can see on your slides, the dotted line is the 3-drug regimen, and the solid line, the dark solid bold line, is the 2-drug regimen. So there is some improvement in both the event-free survival and also the overall survival. The other question that this meta-analysis interestingly asked was, what was the relative advantage of a 4-drug regimen as compared to a 3-drug regimen? And obviously the question was whether a MAP was how did it stack versus a MAP plus ifosfamide. And interestingly, this meta-analysis actually did not show any difference in terms of not only event-free survival but overall survival for a 4-drug regimen versus a 3-drug regimen. You can clearly see that the curves are nearly overlapping. So this established some role for a 3-drug regimen, a methotrexate containing regimen, compared to a 2-drug regimen. But hard data from randomized clinical trials is still wanting, and I think that's a subject of a lot of debate when you talk about chemotherapy regimens for patients with osteosarcoma. What is the role of ifosfamide? So ifosfamide actually had a very promising activity in the recurrent metastatic setting. In fact, one of the studies showed a response rate to the tune of 60%, and therefore it was not surprising that a trial was designed. So this was a study which actually looked at a combination of cisplatin, doxorubicin, high-dose methotrexate, and then along with ifosfamide and muramyl tripeptide, polyethanolamine, and they looked at that data, and one of the analysis that looked at the contribution of ifosfamide to the 3-drug regimen, clearly showing that neither the event-free survival nor the overall survival was actually improved by the addition of ifosfamide. The addition of ifosfamide to the 3-drug regimen, that is doxorubicin, cisplatin, and high-dose methotrexate. So similar to methotrexate, ifosfamide, as the contribution of ifosfamide to the therapeutic regimen has also been subjected to a meta-analysis, and even this meta-analysis suggested that the addition of ifosfamide in the neoadjuvant setting actually did not exhibit any significant effect on either the event-free survival or the overall survival. Is there a role of a 3-drug regimen which is methotrexate-free? Well, I think this has been subjected to a lot of discussion, and I wanted to share this paper from Tata Memorial, Dr. Jyoti Bajpayee's group. They actually looked at an OGS-12 protocol, which was a combination of cisplatin, doxorubicin, and ifosfamide, and they were looking at their own data and to see how their long-term EFS and OS rate stacked up. So this, on the top of your screen, you can look at the regimen. This is the regimen, and the 3-year and 5-year EFS stood at 63% and 60% for the patients who were treated with this regimen. And similarly, the median OS was not attained, but the estimated 3-year and 5-year OS were 82 and 80%. So these are fairly promising results. And in fact, in my practice, for those patients who can tolerate a 3-drug regimen but are not willing or cannot afford a high-dose methotrexate based regimen, these are the patients I actually offer the OGS-12 protocol compared to just cisplatin and doxorubicin. What about increasing the dose? So there have been some interesting studies which actually looked at dose-dense regimen of cisplatin doxorubicin instead of doing it from a 3-weekly to a 2-weekly regimen. Unfortunately, unlike the space in Ewing sarcoma, when you talk about osteosarcoma, dose intensity or dose dense regimen actually did not have any impact on event-free survival, overall survival, although there was some increase in the pathological good responses with the dose dense schedule. Immunotherapy, again, we come back to the same paper which looked at not only the addition of ifosfamide but also MTPE, PE, which is muramyl tripeptide. And the initial results seem to suggest that there was no statistically significant impact of addition of muramyl tripeptide to the chemotherapy backbone. But then there were some updated results which were presented and published later on from the same data set, and this was in 2008. And in fact, surprisingly, while there was no impact on the event-free survival, the difference between the MTP containing regimen and the non-MTP containing regimen in terms of EFS was not statistically significant. There was a statistically significant improvement in overall survival. And there has been some controversy regarding this agent. We know that a lot of immunotherapy medications can actually have no impact on EFS, and yet they can have impact on OS. And because of that, the drug is now approved in Europe, but this is still not approved by the US FDA. So still a matter of debate as to how this drug contributes, and I think we need to look into more data. So this is broadly the neoadjuvant regimen. How do you assess response? I think while there may not be a significant reduction in the size of the tumor when assessed clinically, we know that there is some healing when you look at plain X-rays and MRIs. There may be some ossification of the soft tissue as a response of healing. There may be some reduction in pain. There may be some reduction in biomarkers like serum alkaline phosphatase. And we also know that pathological responses are there, and there are different clinical criteria. You can look at this slide, and this is showing a lot of necrotic necrosis in this specimen. So there are different criteria, and MSKCC criteria are one of the most commonly followed criteria of looking at pathological response. And we know that those who have had a good pathological response, more than 90% actually do well. Which brings us to the question as to how do we deal with poor responders? I mean, one of the argument for offering neoadjuvant chemotherapy was that you could actually treat or the patients who are not responding well differently, and maybe that could lead to some improvement in survival. And this has been studied in a lot of clinical trials. One of the most prominent has been Uramos. Unfortunately, so far there's no data to suggest that changing the chemotherapy regimen in a patient who has had a poor response actually helps. So this is what this study did. So this was a 2x2 design. Those patients who had a more than 90% necrosis were actually randomized to receive interferon alpha versus no interferon alpha, and those who were poor responders actually were randomized to either continue the MAP regimen or switch to an IFOS etoposide based regimen, and this is what they were looking at. But unfortunately, there was no difference in event-free survival between the two groups, those who continued a MAP regimen versus who was switched to a MAP IE regimen. And in fact, when you look at the data, the performance of the MAP IE arm was actually inferior to those of the MAP arm. And clearly, this was also associated with increased toxicity, and therefore, there's still no merit in switching the chemotherapy regimen for those patients who've not had a good pathological response. While we can talk about neoadjuvant and adjuvant chemotherapy, it's very important to look at the time to resumption of chemotherapy after definitive treatment. So every day matters, and the earlier you analysis to suggest that a delayed reinitiation of chemotherapy after surgery can actually have a negative impact on the long-term outcomes. So, what are the new developments? While they unfortunately the survival has not improved. So there have been very few new developments in the advanced setting. We're looking at samarium, we're looking at GM-CSF, we're also looking at trastuzumab for a very small subset of patients who are expressing HER2/neu, but there have been very few new developments. And as I said, there has been no change in the overall survival of osteosarcoma in the studies and the series that were reported in the 80s and the early 90s were this versus the series that have been reported from this millennium. What about chemotherapy in adults? So most of the clinical trials that we just discussed actually looked at patients who were 40 or less. And we do know that older patients seem to be doing worse as compared to children. And there's data from SEER which says that the long-term survival rates for patients in their 50s is 50%, for patients in their 60s is about 70%, and patients who are 80 or more is actually as dismal as 10%. While this does not mean that intensive treatment is not warranted, certainly warranted, pathological response continues to remain prognostic. Unfortunately, the optimal treatment regimen has not been defined. There's only been one trial which actually enrolled patients who are older than 40, and this trial failed to reveal any benefit with the addition of high-dose methotrexate to cisplatin doxorubicin. We do know that these patients do tolerate cisplatin doxorubicin fairly well. In my practice, I would still offer a high-dose methotrexate to an adult more than 40, provided the patient can tolerate it, because we do know that adults, while being treated with high-dose methotrexate, can have a slower clearance, which can translate into mucositis and nephrotoxicity for these patients. And therefore, you need to be very careful. You need to individualize the advice for each adult who comes to you with osteosarcoma, but you need to maintain intensity of treatment for these patients as well. What about metastatic or relapsed osteosarcoma? So for a patient who presents with an upfront metastatic disease, we offer treatment with the same intensity, and our goal has to be complete surgical remission. So while this can be feasible for patients who present with lung metastasis, for those patients who present with bone metastasis, it can be more challenging. There's data to suggest that patients, even in a metastatic disease, who are able to achieve a complete surgical remission can actually go on to be long-term survivals, and those patients who are not able to undergo a complete surgical remission will have very low long-term survival rates. And therefore, even in metastatic disease, we have to be aggressive. We have to offer chemotherapy, and especially those with lung metastasis should be subjected to surgery for removal of the metastatic disease. What about those patients where disease is unresectable or the chemotherapy cannot be offered? So there's no single standard approach. As I said, most of the regimens which have been evaluated for localized disease appear to have some sort of activity even in the metastatic setting. However, the response rates with these regimens seem to be lower, which seems to suggest that probably there's an underlying difference in the biological behavior. There's no role for dose intensive chemotherapy and stem cell transplantation, and there are a lot of ongoing clinical oncology group studies in this setting. So some of the regimens which have actually been evaluated are these. So one of the most widely studied regimen is an high-dose ifosfamide etoposide regimen. In fact, one of the studies which was reported in 2002 showed a very promising overall response rate of 59% with promising 2-year PFS rates of 39%, particularly for patients with metastasis limited to lung and or not spreading to the bone. In fact, these was one of the studies which also escalated interest in the role of ifosfamide in the neoadjuvant setting in localized disease as well. Similarly, there have been some other studies for ifosfamide in not such high doses. Again, response rates have varied from 10 to 20%. 10 to 15%, and there does seem to be some synergism between ifosfamide in these doses along with etoposide, and therefore these are some of the commonly used regimens in a recurrent setting as well. There's some data for ICE, that is ifosfamide, carboplatin, etoposide. We do know that this regimen can be fairly toxic, but the overall risk for this regimen as well. There have been some data for other regimens like gemcitabine docetaxel, very small studies, patient numbers in the range of 20s, 10s or 20s. Again, overall response rates will depend on the size of the study, but 56% progression-free survival rate at 4 months seems promising for heavily pretreated osteosarcoma. So for those patients who've had most of these regimens earlier, gemcitabine docetaxel is an option that could be used, especially for a patient who is fit and can tolerate. Similarly, there have been some data for other alkylators, cyclophosphamide along with etoposide, again phase 2 studies, and then some data for the VEGF TKIs. So we have some data for sorafenib in recurrent metastatic high-grade osteosarcoma, where it did show some beneficial responses, and similarly for regorafenib, where it does seem to have some activity in adult osteosarcomas. Median progression-free survival in the range of about 16.4 weeks, so that's about 4.5 months versus a month for placebo, and progression-free survival rates at 12 weeks in the range of 62%, and 24 weeks of about 35%. So nothing which is very magical, yet it remains a treatment choice, especially for those patients who are not willing for injectable chemotherapy and yet are willing for some sort of therapy. Investigative approaches for other drugs, including eribulin, have not been very promising. We question the role of mTOR inhibitor. We don't know how it contributes, sirolimus, how it contributes to the efficacy of chemotherapy regimens. We also looked at BCG and interferon. And then there has been some excitement about immunotherapy, pembrolizumab, for soft tissue sarcomas, including bone sarcomas. Unfortunately, the small study, the SARC-028, actually had only 22 patients with osteosarcoma. There was only one patient who had a partial response. Similarly, they had 5 patients with chondrosarcoma, where only one responded, and none of the Ewing sarcoma subset responded. So it's still early days for immunotherapy. I think we're looking at more data before this starts becoming a part of the treatment regimen. So these are the NCCN guidelines. You can clearly say that for the first line setting for localized disease, both cisplatin doxorubicin and cisplatin doxorubicin and high dose methotrexate are the recommended regimens. And in the other recommended regimens, ifosfamide can also be combined. And for the second line relapse settings, these are the regimens which have been approved. So quickly moving on to Ewing sarcoma. So we know Ewing sarcoma family of tumor are also inherently systemic disease. We have data to suggest that the advent of chemotherapy, the advent of newer, more intensive protocols has actually led to an improvement in overall survival in not only younger patients with Ewing sarcoma family of tumors, but also older patients in Ewing sarcoma family of tumors. And these are also some of the curves. So these are more contemporary survival rates. Clearly see that patients with localized Ewing sarcoma can have long-term survival in the range of 50 to 60%. Even in metastatic Ewing sarcoma, those with lung limited Ewing sarcoma can still enjoy long-term survival of in the range of 30 to 40%. But those patients who have disease which is spread to the bone, the long-term survival is still fairly dismal at about 10 to 20%, or probably even lesser. So it is, we know that if you treat a patient with Ewing sarcoma, 80 to 90% will relapse if only surgery has been offered. And clearly modern treatment regimens which utilize not only induction or neoadjuvant chemotherapy, but also adjuvant chemotherapy has led to an improvement in overall long-term survival. What we also know that Ewing sarcoma with chemotherapy, there is a reduction in local tumor volume. And now there is data to suggest that chemotherapy also not only plays an important role in local failure rates, but also it can lead to improvement in the surgical, the ability to perform successful surgeries because of reduction in the size of this the disease with the response to neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So this is the current paradigm of treatment, most of these patients are offered neoadjuvant chemotherapy followed by local therapy and followed by more adjuvant chemotherapy, and these are some of the active agents which are used. And so most of these patients will have some sort of neoadjuvant multi-agent chemotherapy for 6 to 24 weeks, followed by definitive treatment. So this is one slide which looks at the evolution of chemotherapy for patients with Ewing sarcoma, and we'll very quickly go through some of the historical study. So one of the first multi-center clinical trial was this one. This was the IESS, the first intergroup study, which actually established the role of doxorubicin. So the historical regimen would be vincristine, dactinomycin, and cyclophosphamide, along with bilateral pulmonary radiation therapy, and this study looked at the contribution of adriamycin, and this was a study which was reported in 1990s, and clearly establishing that with the addition of adriamycin to the VAC regimen, there was a statistically significant improvement in relapse-free survival and overall survival, thus establishing the role of adriamycin in this setting. And then came the IESS-2 study, which actually looked at dose intensification of doxorubicin. So they increased the dose of doxorubicin in the treatment regimen, and that also suggested that there was an improvement in 5-year relapse-free survival with a higher dose of doxorubicin as compared to the lower dose of doxorubicin, although most of the benefit was to non-pelvic lesions. Although there was some concern escalated with the toxicity of doxorubicin containing regimen, and thereafter dactinomycin was omitted to limit the adverse impact and improve long-term outcomes. And then there was this study which was looking at the combination of ifosfamide etoposide to the standard VDCA regimen, and this was reported in NGM 2003, and clearly showing that the addition of ifosfamide etoposide to VDCA was associated with a statistically significantly improved 5-year relapse-free survival of 69% compared to 4% with VDCA alone. Although this was limited to only those patients who had a localized Ewing sarcoma. As you can see, the yellow and the orange curves, those are the metastatic disease receiving either VDCA or VDCA-IE. There was no improvement with the more intensive regimen with the IE. So obviously the next step was dose dense. So they looked at whether giving chemotherapy every 2 weekly, how did it stack up? Just giving the same chemotherapy every 3 weekly. So you're giving the same chemotherapy regimen, same doses, but you're giving them more frequently. And clearly this was associated with a nearly 25% increase in dose intensity. There was no increased toxicity. This led to an improvement in 3-year event-free survival from 65% to 76% in the same population of localized Ewing sarcoma. And there were also some dose intensification, especially with the ifosfamide doses, and these are also subject of children oncology group studies. Unfortunately, dose intensification with the increase of ifosfamide doses or cyclophosphamide doses and thereby shortening the duration of treatment was not associated with any impact on not only event-free survival but overall survival. And for VAC-IE, 2 weeks has been, for most American centers, been the standard of care. In the adult population, we tend to offer VAC-IE more on a 3-weekly basis. Some of the European protocols have actually looked at the wide regimen, and the European protocols have looked at wide regimen, whereas the American regimens have looked at VAC-IE. And interestingly, there was this study, which was the Euro-Ewing 2012 protocol, which actually compared the American regimen, the VAC-IE versus the wide regimen, and the early results were reported this year. So this was ASCO 2020 this year, which actually looked at whatever results were there, and at a median follow-up of 1.7 years. So this is still short follow-up. But this clearly suggests that patients who received the American regimen, the VAC-IE, had a prolonged event-free survival with a hazard ratio of 0.66 and also an overall survival with a hazard ratio of 0.64. And therefore clearly showing that the American regimen is associated with an improved EFS and overall survival, and the grade 3 adverse events were similar in both the regimens. and therefore clearly showing that the VAC-I regimen, at least from this data, seems to be better than the wide regimen. Obviously, we need to look at the long-term results and the full text publication of this study with a lot of interest. So again, is there a role of high-dose chemotherapy with stem cell rescue for patients with localized disease? So this has been a very pertinent question, and this was subject to the Euro-Ewing study, where they actually looked at patients with either a high-volume disease, so disease more than 200 ml in volume, or those patients who have had a poor response to chemotherapy, where after receiving the standard 6 cycles of wide, that's the European protocol, 6 cycles of wide, they were randomized to continue VI for 7 cycles, which is the standard comparator, or 1 cycle of Y followed by busulfan, melphalan based induction followed by high dose chemotherapy, that is the stem cell transplant. And the initial results which were reported in JCO 2018 did seem to suggest that there was some improvement in not only event-free survival, but also overall survival for these patients. So how does this data stack up? So clearly they are looking at the European protocol, so that's 6 cycles of wide. Will it give similar results for those patients who have had the American protocol, dose dense VAC-I or the 3-weekly VAC-I? We don't know. I think there is still some space for those patients who've actually received wide and who either have a high volume disease or have had a poor pathological response. There may be some case for offering high-dose chemotherapy with stem cell rescue for these patients. What about adult patients? Again, similar to osteosarcoma, a very small subset of patients have Ewing sarcoma at the age of 40 or more. Older age is known to have an adverse prognostic impact on the long-term outcomes. We don't know whether this is because of difference in biology, or is it because of the fact that most of the adults will not be able to tolerate or not offered the more intensive pediatric protocols. There are very few clinical trials which have looked at chemotherapy in the older adults. But we do know, with whatever data there is, that patients who've been treated with the more modern and intense neoadjuvant adjuvant chemotherapy protocol will tend to do nearly as well as children, provided they are able to tolerate it. So there was one small retrospective study which did show that the event-free survival in adults treated with the pediatric protocols can be in the range of 60%. At 5 years, similarly, overall survival can be in the range of 70%. And we adults are also being clearly looked into with a lot more interest, whether they do equally well. And therefore, whenever you have an adult patient with an Ewing sarcoma, provided he or she is fit, there would be a strong argument in offering the pediatric protocols to these patients with a close eye on their tolerability. So, how do you assess response to neoadjuvant chemotherapy in Ewing sarcoma? Obviously, there can be symptomatic improvement with relief of pain. Ewing sarcoma, there can be a significant reduction in the soft tissue component, so there may be decrease in size. You can look at the biomarker levels at LDH levels, and they usually fall when you have a disease which is responding, and obviously there will be a radiological improvement. But the most important is the degree of necrosis, and we know that patients who achieve a 95% or greater necrosis, their probability of having a relapse-free survival is much higher compared to those who are not able to achieve this level of necrosis. What about metastatic disease? So we know that patients with overt metastatic disease at presentation would have a significantly worse outcome as compared to those who do not have a metastatic disease. We also know that aggressive multimodality treatment can have a higher chance of relieving pain, prolonging progression-free survival, and in fact, cure some patients. The data has varied. When you talk about cure, obviously there has a lot of heterogeneity in the series, but we do know that even for those patients with metastatic disease, anywhere between 9 to 55% patients may have a long-term improvement. The site of metastasis is very important. Those patients with lung or pleural only metastasis, long-term EFS can be as high as 40%. But those patients who have bone or bone marrow metastasis or combined metastasis, the long-term outcome is more dismal, and the long-term EFS rates are in the range of 10 to 20%. Since it's very difficult to predict who will respond very well, the convention has been to offer intense regimens to all the patients with metastatic disease, irrespective of the site of the disease. Again, this is a graph that I shared earlier, showing how the location of metastasis can be prognostic. In fact, we also know it's not just the location of the metastasis, but also the number of metastasis, the site of the metastasis, the age, and then obviously primary tumor volume, which can lead to an impact on the long-term outcomes of these patients. So there are some pertinent issues for metastatic disease. And one of the first question is, what is the optimal initial chemotherapy regimen that should be offered to those patients who present with an upfront metastatic disease? Again, very few randomized trials have looked at this question because only about 25 to 30% patients present with de novo metastatic disease. When you look at VDC plus standard dose IE, while there was benefit with the addition of IE in the localized disease, specific benefit has not been revealed in those with metastatic disease. Nevertheless, as I said earlier, the convention is to offer combination of VDC IE even in metastatic disease. Similarly, for dose intensified VDC IE, there is very little data to suggest that there is any benefit with the more intense protocols. And again, with the interval compressed VDC IE, again, there is very little experience with the interval compressed regimen. In fact, this is part of an ongoing children's oncology group study, which is looking at the interval compressed VDC IE in the metastatic setting. Again, is there a role of high-dose chemotherapy and stem cell transplant for those patients who present with de novo metastatic disease? EuroEving 99 trial and the EVING 2008 study actually looked at this question. They enrolled patients with age younger than 50 years and de novo pleural or pulmonary metastasis, and these patients received the typical European regimen, 6 cycles of VIDE, and then were randomized to continue receiving VI or the high-dose chemotherapy and the stem cell transplant. Unfortunately, as per the latest result published in 2019, there's no difference in the survival outcomes in the group which received the high-dose chemotherapy versus the conventional chemotherapy. In fact, the patient randomized to the high-dose chemotherapy, 4 of these patients died, and there were significantly higher acute toxicities. So clearly, the only randomized trials revealing no benefit with stem cell transplant for these patients. There have been some contradictory results from retrospective series where some of them have actually showed benefit, others have not. Even in a metastatic Ewing sarcoma where the disease may be disseminated, there may be some role of local therapy, especially where the number of metastases is localized, because it's a local disease which start becoming an issue when the disease stop responding. And these are the NCCN approved regimens. So clearly, the American guidelines preferring the VDCI over VIDE and VI alone. Now we have data to back that in not only the localized disease, but also in the metastatic setting. And there have been other protocols which have been evaluated in the more metastatic setting. So we'll very quickly go over to those patients who are not eligible for a VAC-I or who have had a recurrent disease after VAC-I. Obviously, somebody who's had a long disease-free interval after an intense VAC-I regimen, some of the regimens can be offered again. But those patients who have had an early recurrence before 2 years, the convention is to offer some other regimens. So some of the regimens that have been evaluated include irinotecan temozolomide. We know that there is now data from fairly fair-sized studies to show that they can be associated with response rates ranging from 20 to 40% and disease control rates as high as 70%, with a 6-month PFS rates of nearly 49% and a median PFS of nearly 4 months. Cyclophosphamide topotecan also appears to be an active regimen with nearly similar response rates and progression-free survival. And there's been some interest in other pathways, including the IGFR1 pathway. There's been some studies looking at gemcitabine, docetaxel, ICE, and PARP inhibitors, which obviously suggests that all of these regimens could be an option. So which leads us to the question as to what is the optimal regimen that you should be offering. And one of the studies which is looking at this question is the RECUR study, which is an internationalized randomized controlled trial of chemotherapy for recurrent and primary refractory Ewing sarcoma. And they are looking at gem docetaxel versus high dose ifosfamide versus cyclophosphamide topotecan versus irinotecan temozolomide. And while the updated results are still awaited, we know from this study that the gem docetaxel arm had a worse overall response and PFS compared to other regimens. So, and some initial regimens showing that the irinotecan temozolomide regimen was associated with response rates at 20% and a median PFS of 4.7 months and a median OS of 13.9 months. So we would be clearly looking at this data with a lot of interest to see what is the most effective regimen in this setting. So last part of the talk, is there a role of chemotherapy for other bone sarcomas, particularly chondrosarcoma? So for chondrosarcoma, surgery has been the cornerstone of treatment. And whenever a patient of chondrosarcoma comes to me, I'd very happily refer him to my ortho oncosurgeon, Dr. Akshay. I refer these patients to him. There's no standard of treatment for these patients. There's no standard of care in the adjuvant setting. There's no standard of care even in the advanced setting. And the data regarding the therapeutic options available is fairly sparse. So these are the NCCN guidelines clearly showing that unless the patient has a dedifferentiated or a mesenchymal chondrosarcoma, which are relatively more chemosensitive, so most of the dedifferentiated chondrosarcomas in a metastatic setting would be treated like an osteosarcoma, and mesenchymal would be treated like Ewing sarcoma. Conventional chondrosarcoma, you have very few treatment options, and systemic therapy option will be offered only as a last resort to these patients. So while typically they have been chemo-resistant, there have been some data. So one of the data was this study which was published in Annals of Oncology in 2013, which looked at the activity of chemotherapy in chondrosarcomas. And they had fairly good numbers. So combination chemotherapy was offered in about 98 cases, and single agent chemotherapy was offered in about 82 cases. And most of these regimens included anthracycline. And they actually looked at their data and found that nearly 1%, nearly 15% patient had a CR or a PR, and nearly 41% patient had a stable disease, while there were no objective responses in grade 1 disease. And a closer look revealed that 31% patients with mesenchymal chondrosarcoma and 20% patients with dedifferentiated chondrosarcoma responded. As expected, they are more chemosensitive. When you looked at conventional chondrosarcoma, the response rates were 11%, and for clear cell chondrosarcoma, there were no responses. The median PFS for 4 was around 4.5 to 5 months. The median OS for the entire cohort was 18 months. So there may be some activity. Obviously, when you're looking at these retrospective series, you need to look at the component of mesenchymal and the dedifferentiated chondrosarcomas before you draw any conclusion. But there may be some activity, albeit very small, with chemotherapy anthracycline containing regimen, even for the conventional chondrosarcoma. Again, there has been a lot of interest with novel agents, imatinib, showing some response in the initial studies, but in the more bigger studies, the activity was not meaningful. There has been a look at other regimens, including cyclophosphamide, pazopanib, dasatinib, with some activity in chondrosarcomas. And these are some of the studies which are currently enrolling patients with bone sarcomas and looking at different chemotherapy regimens and target therapies in this setting. So I'll quickly conclude by saying that chemotherapy in bone sarcomas has led to an improvement in survival, both event-free survival and overall survival. And it also seems to enhance local controls rate and improves the chances of limb salvage. For osteosarcoma, while the appropriate regimen is still debated, there is some data to suggest that a 3-drug regimen may be better and should be preferred as compared to a 2-drug regimen. Similarly, for Ewing sarcoma, the American VAC-I regimen remains the treatment of choice, and particularly in the younger subgroup, wherever it can be tolerated, a dose-dense regimen should be offered. Even for patients with metastatic disease, select few patients, a long-term cure may be possible with aggressive multimodality treatment. In recurrent setting, chemo continues to offer some improvement in quality of life, improvement in palliation of symptoms, and may offer a valuable tool to assess responses of chemotherapy. And in fact, there's a lot of interest in assessing the role of target therapy and immunotherapy, particularly in the advanced setting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for a wonderful talk, sir. It was very extensive and a very useful class, sir. Sir, can we have the questions now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Any questions? Sir,
So I think I can see a question in the chat box.
Sir, question is, do you offer DD chemotherapy in all living sarcoma patients?
So, yeah, no. I think this is dose dense. I think the question pertains to dose dense chemotherapy in all living sarcoma patient. I think most of my pediatric oncology colleagues are fairly open to a dose dense regimen. Unfortunately, I deal more with adult oncology, and in my experience, most of the adult patients are not able to tolerate a dose dense 2-weekly regimen. But I think looking at the results, looking at the improvement in the event-free survival rates, that was nearly 10% improvement in the EFS rates with the dose dense protocol. I feel it should be offered to most pediatric patients, provided the logistics allow it.
Any other questions? So I think you have covered all the topics extensively. And there's no more questions in the chat box. Anybody who wants to ask any questions?
So I think either the audience got really bored or I was able to explain everything very nicely.
Right, it was a very extensive class, sir. I think you have covered all the things.
Right. So I think with that we'll probably call the meeting to a close. But feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, and either directly or through the DMSOG platform.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.